Well, welcome back, everybody, to this week's OLA Adult Dad Faith Formation Gospel Podcast, where we get together each week and spend a couple of minutes unpacking the Sunday Gospel passage. I'm Charles Merritt. I'm in front of the camera. Max is behind the camera as usual. We're on the campus of St. Bonaventure High School. And if you're saying, the blue shirt again, Charles, this is the third week in a row. Well, again, like we said last week, we've got some time, so Max and I decide to film several of these back-to-back, so we're a little ahead of the curve. So I'm filming this about 2 minutes after I filmed the last one, which I filmed 2 minutes after I filmed the first one. So this is the third of 3 in a row we're filming, hence the same shirt. So it's not for a lack of wardrobe, it's just that we're kind of doing these back-to-back. Again, probably too much information, but just in case you're wondering, does the guy have any other shirts? Yes, I do. So it's a Gospel of, or the year of Mark. We're back in the Gospel of Mark after being in the Gospel of John for a couple of weeks. Now we're going to move out of chapter 7, where we've been the last 2 weeks, into chapter 8, specifically verses 27 to 35. So before we kind of set up and dive into the narrative, again, context, right? Read, listen, and watch closely because words have meaning, right? I've got my pause button right next to me, so away we go. Now, we're in the midst of a presidential election. We're in the midst of campaign season, right? And there's all kinds of public opinion polls, all kinds of surveys, about where the candidates stand, right? And if you wondered, this whole business of taking public opinion polls, when did this ever start? Well, I submit it started right here in Mark 8, verses 27 to 35, because one could argue, and as you see this play out, you'll kind of see why I'm going in this direction. One could argue that in verses 27 to 35 of Mark chapter 8, this gospel passage that we're going to hear this Sunday, Jesus himself takes the first public opinion poll because he asks his disciples, hey, who do people say that I am? And the disciples give him various opinions of who the people say he is. And then he turns to his disciples and he says, okay, that's great, but who do you say that I am? And the disciples give their opinion. So if you think about it, and of course this is all tongue-in-cheek, right? This could well be the first public opinion poll in the history of the world. So, I'm not sure where that fits into anything, but it was kind of curious. So let's go ahead and dive in, all right? Now, let's set the geographic context first, because that's very important. Jesus is in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Now again, Jesus is going to ask the disciples, who do people say he is and who do you say he is? So Jesus is going to be asking about who people think he is. Who and what is his identity? A massive, critical question, right? Now again, consider this. He could have asked this question at any point in his public ministry. He could have asked it anywhere he went in his public ministry. But he asked it specifically now and specifically at this place, Caesarea Philippi. And we know God is intentional. Everything he does has intent and purpose and a reason behind it. Nothing is coincidence when it comes to God, right? So, Jesus purposely asked this question at this specific time, at this specific place. So it begs us to ask the question, why? Well, let's look at the place first, Caesarea Philippi. Now, back previous to this, back in the day, this was ground zero, if you will, for pagan worship, all right? They worshipped the god Pan. And originally, this region was named after that god. It was called Pan. And it had kind of a well in it, all right? And that well was looked at as the portal to hell, all right? That's what this region was about back in the day. It was ground zero for pagan worship, and it had a well that was looked at as the portal to hell. All right? Well, let's fast forward to where we are now. Herod the Great, okay, he had a number of sons. And when he died, he split up his territory among his sons. One of his sons was Herod Philip. And the territory that Herod Philip got was this territory. So when Herod Philip got this territory, he changed the name of it from Pan to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea was in honor of Caesar. Philippi was in honor of himself. So the Caesarea is in honor of Caesar. The Philippi is in honor of himself, Herod Philip. So that's why this region is called Caesarea Philippi. All right? Now the second question, why would Jesus bring his disciples here to ask them who he is, when here is a previous ground zero for pagan worship, where here had that well that was looked at as the portal to hell? Okay? And the answer is to just juxtapose in the sharpest possible way, okay, himself as God versus Satan, okay? And that God is going to conquer Satan. And to do so, he's going to elicit from his disciples, as we'll find out, that he is the Christ. He is the Son of God. He's going to elicit that statement from his disciples at what was previously ground zero for pagan worship. So in that regard, it's very fitting. It's a very fitting place for Jesus to ask this question. So that's the geographic context, and that's very important for us to know. Now let's get into the text. Let's get into the actual public opinion poll. He says, okay, guys, what's the word on the street? Who do people say I am? And they offer three opinions. They say, well, some people's opinion, they say you're John the Baptist. Others' opinion, they say you're Elijah. Others' opinion, they say you're one of the prophets. Hit the pause button. Why these three? Why do some people think he's John the Baptist? Why do some people think he's Elijah? Why do some people think he's one of the prophets? This is the reason, okay? Why do some people think he's John the Baptist? Well, John the Baptist was a great prophet, right? So they figure, okay, and of course he had been killed. He had been beheaded by Herod. So maybe they think, well, Jesus is a prophet just like John the Baptist is. Maybe he's even a greater prophet, okay? So by evoking he's John the Baptist, people are essentially saying, well, he's a prophet. A great prophet, but a prophet. By other people say he's Elijah. Why would some people hold that opinion? Well, because Jewish tradition held that before the Messiah and Savior would come, Elijah would come back from the dead and would precede him. And Elijah was a great prophet. So some people think, well, maybe this guy is Elijah come back from the dead and is a great prophet. And then other people's opinion is he's one of the prophets. So what's kind of the common denominator among the three different opinions? That Jesus is not, as the disciples will admit, the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. They look at Jesus as merely a prophet, merely a human being, a great prophet, maybe greater than John the Baptist and Elijah and all the other prophets, but a prophet nonetheless, and just a mere man. So that's kind of the commonality of the three opinions. That's kind of what the word on the street was about Jesus. Hey, he's a great rabbi, he's a great teacher, he's a great moralist, maybe he's even a great prophet, but nothing more than that. He's, basically just a great man, all right? Jesus says, okay, that's the word on the street. Then he turns to his disciples and says, okay, let me ask you guys a question, okay? Who do you say that I am? And once again, and we've seen this a number of times already, and we'll see it a number of times before we finish the year of Mark, Peter steps up and speaks for the rest of the disciples, okay? And what does he say? He says, you are the Christ, you are the Son of God. So contrast what Peter, for the disciples, how they see Jesus versus how the crowds see him, okay? And they're making the statement that Jesus is the Christ, the Christos, the Anointed One, the Messiah, the Son of God. They're making this statement on what was previously ground zero of pagan worship that had the portal to hell, okay? Now, how does Jesus respond to Peter's statement, you are the Christ, you are the Son of God? Well, in the Gospel of Matthew records Jesus following this by saying, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it. Matthew records that portion of Jesus' response. Mark doesn't record that portion. Mark records that on the heels of this, Jesus gives what will be the first of three what are called passion predictions, where he tells his disciples exactly what's going to happen when they enter Jerusalem eventually during Holy Week. So this is the first of three times Jesus gives what are called the passion predictions. And he gives his first one, this is critical now, he gives his first one on the heels of Peter saying, we believe you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Savior, the Son of God. Now, Jesus, in giving this, his first passion prediction on the heels of this, is essentially telling Peter and the disciples, yes, you're right, that is who I am. I am the Christ, I am the Anointed One, I am the Messiah, I am the Son of God. But I'm not the kind of Messiah many people expect and hope. I am, as our buddy Isaiah prophesied, right? I am a suffering Messiah. And then he tells the disciples what that suffering is going to include, okay? He's going to be betrayed. He's going to be killed. But he's going to rise on the third day. Now, how does Peter respond to this? Peter rebukes Jesus, okay, and basically says, God forbid, Jesus, this is not going to happen to you. So Peter rebukes Jesus. And by Mark using the word rebuke, words have meaning, all right? Mark is telling us, Peter tried to set Jesus straight, if you will, in the most forceful way. It's in essence Peter saying, hey, you say you're going to suffer and die and all of that stuff. Let me tell you what's going to happen. In essence, that's what Peter is saying when he says, God forbid this is not going to happen to you. It's almost Peter saying, hey, Jesus, let me tell you how it's going to go. Kind of how sometimes we act, where Jesus says one thing and we say, no, Jesus, this is the way it should go. So again, like I've mentioned in the past, Peter's probably my favorite disciple, my favorite apostle, because I see so much of myself in him, in his foibles. But at any rate, so Peter rebukes Jesus and basically says, no, it's not going to happen this way, all right? Because again, what was the conventional thinking? We mentioned this in previous podcasts. The conventional thinking that was that this Messiah, this Savior, was going to be a political military one who was going to start a revolution and free God's people from the oppression of Caesar and Rome, all right? He was going to be that kind of Savior. And of course, Jesus is not that kind of Savior. The oppression he's going to deliver the people from is not Caesar and Rome, it's Satan and sin. And he's not going to set up an earthly kingdom. He's going to set up a spiritual one. And his throne is not going to be a gaudy throne. His throne eventually is going to be the cross. So when Jesus says, yes, you're right, Peter, I am the Savior, I am the Messiah, but I'm not the kind of Messiah conventional thinking says I am, all right? I'm a suffering Messiah. And Peter, that kind of rocks his world. And he says, no, you're not that kind of Messiah. Peter rebukes him. Now, how does Jesus respond to the rebuke? He turns around and rebukes Peter even harsher. He says, "Get behind me, Satan," because you're thinking as man thinks, not as God thinks. Get behind me, Satan. I cannot think of, in a previous week, in a previous podcast, we had Jesus rebuking the Pharisees and scribes and calling them hypocrites, and that's a harsh rebuke. This is harshness to the max. Get behind me, Satan. Now, a lot of people go, oh man, Jesus just called Peter Satan. No, he didn't, in a manner of speaking. He uses the name Satan. But when Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, we've got to understand what the name Satan means. Now, Satan, the devil, his given name is Lucifer, all right? We know him as Satan. The Bible calls him Satan because the word Satan the name Satan comes from the word Satan. And Satan means adversary. And that's exactly what the devil is. He's an adversary to God. So since Lucifer, the devil, is an adversary to God, and since the word Satan means adversary, that's why Lucifer has come to be known as Satan. So when Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan, what he's telling Peter is, Peter, you rebuking me and telling me I'm not going to be a suffering Messiah, that you're being adversarial. You're setting yourself up as an adversary to God's plan, because the Father's plan is that I be a suffering Messiah. And when you say, no, you're not going to be, you are putting yourself at odds with God's plan. You are being an adversary. You are being a Satan. So it's in that vein that Jesus calls Peter Satan, okay? But nevertheless, it's still a harsh rebuke. Okay? Jesus, in indicating he's going to be the suffering Messiah, is indicating to his disciples, and by extension us, okay, that the way to the crown goes through the cross. Okay? Yes, Jesus is king. Yes, he has established a kingdom. But his throne is that cross on Calvary. When the throne he's going to mount is going to be that cross he's crucified on. And this is the first of 3 times. We see it once in Mark 8, we'll see it once in Mark 9, once again in Mark 10. This is the first of 3 times Jesus is trying to reorient his disciples to the kind of Messiah he is. Not a military, political, earthly one, but a suffering one. Okay? And this kind of rocks their world, all right? So, 18, 19 minutes, a little over, but not as bad as a couple of podcasts ago. So this gives us hopefully a better understanding and some background on Mark 8, verses 27 to 35. So keep some of these things in mind when you hear it proclaimed on Sunday. And as always, until we meet again for episode 62, take care and God bless everybody.